Let's move to our first presenter, which is the Reverend Dr. Marcos Miranda. And Reverend Hersey will be introducing Marcos.
I praise God for my brother Marcos. A number of years ago, I was asked to check him out. I had turned over everything that I had done up here in the North area for Adirondack Emergency Community Chaplains to Marcos after I checked him out for about 2 years. And I have been so impressed with what God has done in and through him, as starting the New York State Chaplain Task Force and the U.S. Chaplains Task Force. He's got presently about 5,400 chaplains that are serving. He's covering about 13 of the major religions that are part of this interfaith group. And what he has done in training and education, he himself has 9 CPU, clinical pastoral education, CPE units. So he's the trainer of trainers and has done tremendous work in outreaching throughout the state and out the country as a teacher and a professor. He is definitely a board certified clinical supervisor, and he supervises students here and abroad. I am very thrilled that he's dealing with a cultural sensitivity trauma. How can I help? And so I turn it over to my brother, Marcos, Dr. Marcos Miranda.
Thank you, Bruce. And it's so amazing to be here again with each and every one of you. I know many of you and the others I'd love to know. Thank you, Peter, for the invitation as always. Chris, great to see you as always. Evelyn, I can barely see you, but it's great to see you on your screen there. But for everybody else, God bless you, and I'm happy to be here. And so I guess, are we going to try to allow me to share my screen, Peter?
We will. I just made Chris Mogensen the host. So Chris, you're going to have to share your screen over to Marcos.
In a second. All right, share screen. Here we go.
You'll have to make Marcos.
You'll have to make me a host.
Oh yeah, if I have to do that.
Yeah.
Oh, how do I do that?
Same place on the upper right-hand side when you.
Yeah.
Upper right-hand side.
Yeah, where you have that.
Where it says more.
Where it says more.
I just have upper right-hand side, just a view. Huh. More.
There should be like 3 dots to the right of that says more. When you put your cursor up top, when it drops down.
No, I just got.
Now
Oh, Karen's the host now. Karen's the host.
Okay, Karen, can you shift hosting over to Marcos?
Yeah, I didn't have any dots there at all.
Oh, now Chris is the host. Chris, we don't want.
Okay.
Karen is the host.
We're
right.
both hosts now, it looks like.
Okay, just a minute.
Oh my.
Okay, just a minute. Okay, Marcos,
you're
you're
host now
the
too. Yep.
Marcos, you're the host now.
Beautiful, thank you. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, is everybody good with that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Let me just get my panel up. Okay, so here we are. Right off the top, I'd like to just let everybody know that obviously these at least this presentation, my presentation, this is kind of a 101 on this area, because obviously this is something that carries a lot of information, and so it's the kind of things that we either do in all-day workshops and sometimes even a few days. So for the little time that we do have together, I just want to go over the 101 and on culturally sensitive trauma and how we can help. Again, I'm Reverend Dr. Marcos Miranda, and thank you, Bruce, again for that wonderful introduction. All right, so I guess the first question would be, what is culturally sensitive trauma and informed care? And I think that in many areas, our areas, whether it's in docs or whether it's in hospitals or the military or even in the crisis chaplaincy that our organization is involved in, we all have cultural sensitivity training to some extent, some more than others. And this is incredibly important, especially now more than ever. However, in addition to that, we should get more involved in culturally sensitive trauma, right? And informed care. And what this is basically the capacity for chaplains like ourselves or that are part of healthcare professionals, but chaplains in any arena, to be able to effectually provide, trauma-informed assessments and interventions that acknowledge, respect, and integrate patients and families and cultural values, beliefs, and practices. So this goes a little further, right? So this is going to go a little further than just simply knowing somebody's religion or faith group, or perhaps knowing what their race is. This goes further, and this can be used for anywhere from children to adults. So for all intents and purposes throughout this training, you'll hear the word client, and you can apply that to either patients or residents, inmates, whatever the case may be, but we'll use the word client in general. And again, like I said, this is something that can complement cultural competent practices that are already in place. And for most of us, they are already in place. I think what makes culturally sensitive trauma unique is that, again, it pays even closer attention to other cultural variations in the client's and family's experience of their response to trauma, Now, again, when we go deeper into assessing someone, a client, there are things in their culture, there are things in their past in terms of perhaps traumas that they went through when they were children, or the way being really open to the way their families have dealt with trauma in the past, to the point where it may be difficult to do an assessment unless you can gain their trust, unless you can start, in many ways, talking their language. Research has shown us that there is this universal biological response to trauma. However, when we're talking about this culturally sensitive trauma, we're talking about more of a psychosocial experience of trauma, and perhaps even subsequent traumatic stress reactions. So we're not just simply talking about the general reactions of trauma with the fears and perhaps the anxieties and everything that we can learn in areas like, for instance, critical incident stress management or critical incident stress debriefing, but it goes beyond that to a psychosocial experience, right? And it combines what things that may have happened to the client when they were children, when they were growing up, as well as what their cultural expression is within their family unit, So when viewed through a cultural lens, let's keep in mind that a client clients or families' perceptions are subjective perceptions. That's the first thing. They're not objective by any stretch of the imagination. They are subjective of the trauma experience. And this can be very, very different to ourselves, right? Or to the provider. And let's just say that the provider can be a healthcare provider as well as a spiritual care provider. And an example of that is that in some cultures, illness or trauma may be interpreted differently. They can be interpreted as something that is spiritual, something that is religious. It can be it can even be interpreted as some sort of punishment, right, or some sort of test. Or if in many cultures it could be a test, right? I'm being tested by God, and that's why I'm going through this. And it's important for us as practitioners. It's important for us as providers that we know this, because this is going to help us in making a professional and appropriate assessment. Again, cultural differences can also exist in beliefs about and if and how to resolve trauma and stress symptoms. So again, when we're dealing with a client perhaps who has either been dealing with issues or been traumatized since childhood, or obviously has been part of their culture or part of their family history, where they look at trauma in a very different way than many of us would look at trauma. If they see it as some sort of a test, if they see it as of some sort of punishment, then they may not be willing to seek help. And even when we do try to help, they may not feel like sharing, or they may not feel like it's time to deal with it, right? And so that could be very difficult as well. Again, we have to remember that some of the interpretations may differ from ours. However, it is important, and it is imperative that we as the providers, that we try to, in our assessment, understand what trauma means to them. We have to keep in mind, and I know that, I may be preaching to the choir, but we can never hear this enough. That time of assessment is about them. It's about the client. It's about the patient. It's about the inmate. It's about their families. It's not about us. And so we need to do our best to practice our listening skills, our active listening skills, and we need to really, really try to find out what trauma means to them. And then as we are continuing on with the conversation or with the assessment, we try to then use those beliefs, and we try to use, and you'll hear me talk about language in a little bit, we try to use the language that they use to talk about trauma, not our language, because that may be something they don't understand or don't feel comfortable with. But we want to go ahead and kind of pay close attention so that we understand, number one, what the trauma means to them and what the language is that they use when speaking of said trauma. And then we try to continue to use that language in the midst of our assessment. So what happens when trauma occurs, right? When trauma occurs, the clients and families obviously go into self-protective mode, right? There is this belief about safety and vulnerability, responsibility, and also the appropriate way that they believe that they should be coping, right? And all this plays obviously a major role in how not only the trauma impacts them, but it plays a major role in how they're going to deal with that trauma, and perhaps even how we're going to be able to deal with the trauma that they are going through. Keep in mind that initially many, if not most, of the traumatized clients and families feel very vulnerable. They feel very, very physically unsafe. It's a very difficult time for them, and especially a difficult time for trusting others, accepting help, and even accepting results, right? Results. So when we look at this through a cultural lens, and that's what we're trying to do when we're dealing with culturally sensitive trauma, a lot of the clients that we will come across are not going to trust not only healthcare providers, but in many cases, not even the chaplain, right? Not even the chaplain. But I would say this, if anyone, and this is on our behalf, if anyone has a really great chance of, breaking through, right? Getting across some of these barriers that are going to be placed up, it's the chaplain, right? The chaplain is going to be able to spend time with this client, with their families. And my hope and my prayer is that chaplains will continue to educate themselves in cultural sensitivity trainings, but also in things like culturally sensitive trauma, and even in things like critical incident stress management and stress debriefing. These are things that we should have in our toolbox if we don't have them as of yet. Again, in these types of instances where there's a lack of trust about what we're hearing and what we are trying to communicate to them, at times we need to, and I think we do this a lot as chaplains, but we need to do it even better. We need to take a step back, right, and really assess, how they perceive the trauma, right? I can't mention that enough, but I'll try to continue to mention it throughout this presentation. We need to continue to work on trying to assess how they are seeing or how they perceive, because it is a matter of perception most of the time. How do they perceive the trauma, right? And again, sometimes that means that we not only deal with the client, but we do everything we can to try to connect with the family if that is possible. And of course, depending on the client's age, if we're allowed to even include other people, and we need to do everything that we can. We cannot limit ourselves. We need to take that opportunity to even include other types of professionals if they're available, but also if the client is willing to see them. But even depending on the culture that you're dealing with, even traditional healers, who the client, depending on who the client is, they may trust that even more. Someone who is considered perhaps a religious advisor or a traditional healer within their culture, right? In other words, trying to get the people involved that are going to allow the client to really express themselves and perhaps even to come to terms with what they're going through, but doing it with those closest to them, doing it in a way where they feel comfortable. So again, I mentioned that safety and trust is established, and sometimes we think that it's simply words, and obviously our words play a major role. Our words can have the power to open up the individuals or individual that we're dealing with, or to shut them down. And so as chaplains, and I believe you've heard me talk about this even in past presentations, we need to choose our words carefully. We need to choose our words carefully. We know that we're having a good visit when we're dealing with a client, when we're just, putting short questions out there and they're doing most of the talking. And perhaps we're not doing such a great job if we're doing most of the talking and they are not. However, actions, I know it sounds cliche and we hear it all the time, actions can speak louder than words. Well, in some cases it does. In some cases it really, really does. And so remember that when we're talking about dealing with somebody or being culturally aware when dealing with someone, it's important the provider client or the chaplain client interaction must start with trying to build trust, right? Trying to build trust. And if it's someone who you're doing follow-up visits with, then obviously building a rapport would help incredibly toward that provider-client relationship. And that also has shown, studies have shown that, of course, the more rapport and the more there is some sort of a relationship, the higher the level of patient communication. And at the end of the day, that's really what we are looking for. We must remember, and I think that most of us know this, but if for some reason we don't, it is important to understand that in certain cultures, people handle things in different way, and they're they can be very, very highly sensitive to nonverbal communication, right? And this includes eye contact and your tone of voice, facial expressions, body language, and touch, okay? You may come across a client, for instance, that will not give you eye contact, right? And we know this because they come from a culture or they come from a family establishment that says don't look into the eyes of the authority, right? Or don't look into the eyes of adults. And even though they may be children, and they won't look into the eyes of adults when being spoken to, this transcends, right, time. And so even adult clients who come from these cultures, they too may not give you eye contact, all right? And so what we've seen in many cases is that there have been cases where people will try to establish and spend a lot of time establishing this eye contact when there is no need for that. We need to understand that this is important to them, right? That not establishing eye contact, for instance, is important to them. And so we should receive that. We should receive that and continue the assessment even when there is no eye contact. And this is obviously one example of this and when doing these types of assessments. Tone of voice, again, plays a major role. If you have a really authoritative voice or a voice that sounds like you're interrogating, this can shut people down. This will shut a client down immediately. And again, why? Because you're coming across as someone who in their culture is in a place of authority, right? And in that place of authority, you keep quiet. You keep quiet. And so if we use this tone of voice and we realize that may impact the assessment, then we need to make some changes. We need to make changes. Again, we also need to be careful with our own body language and how we react and expressions, our facial expressions. And I've always trained many in the past and I always use the word, and I hate to use this word, but I say, keep a poker face, right? And I don't mean really keep a poker face as in just being some sort of frozen, person in front of the client. But be very careful what your facial reactions are when you are receiving the information. Because this could be very, very, it can be taken as something very detrimental, or in many cases, it can be taken as something that is offensive by the way we are reacting. And of course, I think we all know this one, touch, right? We all see touch almost as a ministry when it comes to spiritual care provisions. And yet some people do not want to be touched. Again, it could be culturally, but also it could be because of past traumas where they don't want to be touched. On the other side, you may come across someone who would like their hand held, depending on how much they've opened up and how much they are willing to give of themselves throughout the assessment. So this is something we have to really keep an eye out for when dealing with these types of assessments, as I said before. And again, the more we can invest our time in who they are and how they perceive things and how, again, they see things, the more success we can have and the more trust we can build. And of course, this will help us in working with our teams and in reporting information back to them, information that can be very, very helpful in not only dealing and choosing the program that we're going to use to help this person, but also in helping the individual feel that they can receive what we have to offer. And I think that that's incredibly, incredibly important. So very quickly, let's go into how to assess, right? So what should we be doing, right? And so I'll just talk about 3 different aspects of assessing the needs at this time. But key things are, and I think that we talk about this all the time, right? The number 1 skill of a chaplain, right? And listening and active listening, maintaining openness, and of course, we can't say this enough, being respectful of the differences in our clients' culture, our clients' religious expression. This is really, really, even our clients, what they wear, right, on themselves, whether it's some sort of an amulet, whether it's a rosary, whether it's a kufi, whether it's a kippah, just in general, being very, very respectful of their culture and their differences. So let's talk a little bit more about the assessment process, right? So listening for variations in understanding. This is really, really important. I can't tell you the amount of times that I've dealt with people, even counseled other spiritual care providers who feel they're not getting enough out of their visits or out of their assessments. And as we go through the process, sometimes I'll have them do some role play, right? And have them go through, how they handle a visit or an assessment. What we end up seeing is that we put too much of ourselves into the process. We're not allowing, in doing that, we're not allowing the client to put more of themselves to the assessment. And that's really what we're looking for. We're looking to get to a place where they are putting more of themselves and communicating more of themselves in the process than we are, right? And so I put some questions here, and again, these questions can be customized, and you can really come up with your own. But some questions that can be used is, what is, right, your understanding of what is happening? It would be great if at that point you already know a little bit about the language that the client uses or that the families are using, and kind of ask this question using more of their language. But this here is the basic foundation of what you're trying to get at, right? It is not about what our understanding is, right? Our general understanding of what people go through when they are when they're traumatized or when they're going through trauma or a traumatic situation, but how do they see it, right? How do they understand what is happening in their lives? And again, this is an opportunity where we can go ahead and provide the psychoeducation or the common themes behind trauma. We can go ahead and lay that out, all the universal types of reactions to trauma. However, that's not going to be helpful unless they start to communicate with us about what those universal reactions, how they interpret those universal reactions. How do they see them? How do they see them? I've been in situations where I'll put out all these universal reactions, and the individual will not see any of it as, I had a case where they didn't see any of it as a reaction to trauma. They saw themselves as just simply going through life, and didn't even want to address the fact that they were in trauma. I later found out, and as we're going to talk here, I later found out that these universal reactions I was putting on the table were things that in his culture, if he were to say, yes, this is what I am going through, in his culture, he would be seen as someone who is not mentally stable, who would be having some sort of a mental breakdown or been going through some sort of mental duress. And so you have to work with that. Another thing is, what is worrying you or your family the most? You'll notice that in some of these questions, we'll start including the family, especially if even if we're dealing with an adult. The families are usually involved when you're dealing with children right off the bat. But when dealing with adults, they may or may not want you to communicate what is going on with their families. But in many cultures we've seen, or however, in many cultures we've seen, that the family unit, these family units are really tight, right? And they all play a major role in each other's lives. And so the client may feel more comfortable than not with the family present, right? And the family involved in the actual training. And so you have to be able to make that assessment. Do they feel comfortable responding to these personal questions about emotional distress around their families, or do they feel more comfortable? Or do they feel less comfortable? You know, and so this is really important, because until you can figure that out, you're not going to get the results that you are looking for. And if the family or even friends, right, in many cultures are very important to this client, you might want to find out, what does your family, right? What do your family, what do your friends think about it, right? Or what you're going through. And again, it is through the process of listening that we start to figure out whether how important family or friends, right? And how important their take is to, right? And so that's important, because once you start that, it's important to know that everyone is included, or that you're going to just deal with this adult client. In many cases, and depending on the cultural background and upbringing, what part of the world the client comes from, in many cases you find that the assessment must be done in conjunction with the family, right? It must be done in conjunction with the family. Opinions play a major role in what this client is going to choose to do. I mean, what they're going to choose to do, or what they're willing to discuss about their experience. And again, this will then help us deal with the outcome and with the treatment plan that we may come, you know, that we may want to go ahead and establish. And I think this one is more basic, but it's still incredibly important, even when we're dealing with trauma. You know, finding out what this individual's family and kinship networks are, right? Who do you normally turn to for support? And this may be something that happens in the initial visit, right? This may be something that happens in the initial visit. But again, giving them the option to incorporate the family or you know, or friends in regards to dealing with their trauma is something that's very important. You know, we need to let them, if they're adults, let them make the decision regarding who they feel comfortable having this information, right? Information that we're getting throughout the assessment. It's okay for us to be able to ask, should anyone else be involved with helping your family or helping you, right? And again, depending on the culture, family, friends, spiritual leaders, depending on how religious they are, you know, this can play a major role. Patriarchs, all of these play major roles. I dealt with a situation probably a few years back where even though the family was there, they had to wait for the grandmother to fly in. She was the matriarch of this family. She was the chief, right? And so they had to wait for her to fly in. We had to reschedule a number of times. And once the grandmother was there, oh my God, the difference was, like night and day. The person opened up, the person was able to talk to. But it was incredible to see that before each answer that the client gave me, they would look over to the grandmother. They would look over to the grandmother, and gestures were made where they were allowed to speak or not to speak, all right, or cut off when perhaps the grandmother thought that it was too much. That's something that we can keep in mind of. But bringing others into the assessment is very helpful when dealing with culturally sensitive trauma. And then again, are you open, right? Just getting to the point at some point in the assessment, are they open to referrals and resources that can help? And again, these can be professional resources. They can also be cultural resources, right? They could be resources they feel comfortable with because they're familiar with it within their culture, all right? So whereas dealing with us as chaplains may not be something they feel comfortable with, they may feel comfortable with working with us as chaplains in conjunction with their spiritual leader, right? Or their spiritual advisor. And so that's something that you can go ahead and decide whether you want to go ahead and bring in these other individuals into the assessment process. Being respectful of different communication practices, that's also really incredibly important. Understanding and get to that place where you start to get information about who typically makes decisions about the client. And you heard me use the example of the grandmother, right? The matriarch in the case of that case, in the case that I had in the past. That was the person who made the family decisions for sure. However, asking this question is very, very important because you can go ahead and try to do an assessment, have a conversation, and try to build a relationship until you're blue in the face. And yet there may be something missing. And if you can find out what that is, in this case, who is the one who typically makes decisions, and you can get that individual involved, then all of a sudden it opens everything up, right? All of a sudden you're building rapport. All of a sudden the client is feeling more comfortable because you understand and respect the importance of the role, right? And the dynamics within their family. How important is that? I would say incredible. I would say incredibly. Also, information should and can be shared. If you're dealing with an adult client, obviously, what are the limitations? Have them kind of give you the limitations of what you can and cannot share with their families and with their friends when it comes to the discussions that's being had or the decisions that you thought about. And again, like I said before, and I probably will mention this one more time after this, is there anyone else who knows of the situation that you would like me to talk to? That's another question. Again, these are questions you can customize and really just, to your liking. But getting to that place where you ask if there's anyone else that they would like you to talk to or that they would like you to involve in the process. Again, extended family, clergy, healers, that is incredibly important because there can be a major difference between dealing just with them or including these other resources or individuals that would make them feel even more comfortable. So you need to think about. So again, as in the title, how we can help, right? And it's important to understand that every client, and I think we all know this, and every family's needs are different. And when we're dealing with culturally sensitive trauma, we may be even more different than we're accustomed to, right? Because we're now not just dealing with a particular situation that we're used to or illness. We are dealing with trauma. We are dealing with crisis. We are dealing with things that may have come from way back when the client was a child. We may be dealing with a child. And so now we're dealing with the child and with the family. So not only trying to get to the point where we understand what the trauma is, but then understanding that the way they perceive that is and can be quite different is important for us to know. This is information that we need to know as providers. And safety and are created not only, like I said before, and this is kind of like summarizing that, not only through our words, but also through the way we behave in front of this client, right? Our willingness to go that extra mile to work with them. They see this, they will recognize this, and hopefully this will, again, build rapport and build trust. Cultural sensitivity helps to create what? Interactions that will promote trust, care, and openness. And whether it's the chaplain, whether it's the medical provider and the client. So one of the things that we need to do as we come toward the end of this presentation is that we have to think about relationships, right? It's about building a relationship, and we have to view relationships through a culturally sensitive, trauma-informed lens. In other words, a lot of times, if we're not having a good day, we may look at relationships the way we see them regularly, right? The way we see them with other clients that may not be dealing with sensitive trauma, culturally sensitive trauma. We need to know that we're dealing with something totally different here, and so we need to look at it through culturally sensitive trauma. We need to first and foremost understand what our role is as a provider, and especially within their world or within this family's world. How do they? That's something that's really important to assess. How do they see us in this during the assessment process, right? We need to do all we can and get as much information as we can to understand roles and dynamics within this family. And again, no two families are alike. And I believe, I totally understand that there may be many similarities, especially when you're dealing with people within the same culture. Even within the same culture, the dynamics can be very, very different. It's important for us as we're doing our listening, right? We're doing our listening to hear what the language is. Right? What are the terms that the family uses, right? They may not be terms that we are used to using when talking about trauma, when talking about crisis. And as we pick up the terms that they're using, we then try to use those terms in language throughout the rest of the assessment. And that, let me tell you, that works wonders. That works wonders. We need to focus on the distress and trauma in the way that the client describes it, what we believe is going on or think is going on, but what do they think is going on? So we need to kind of see it from their perspective. And again, we should always consider and facilitate the inclusion of others when possible. Again, I told you I would mention that a few times because it's actually quite important. When we view the assessment through culturally sensitive trauma and a trauma-informed lens, we want to go ahead and ask about decision-making practices. Again, we talked about that. Who ultimately makes the decisions in the family? We need to respect their wishes. And this, I think, is part of what we do when we do assessments anyhow. So there are some overlapping. But again, be open to involving others and their customs if that is something that make the client more comfortable or it's requested by the client. And remember that depending on the individual and their culture and even the trauma within their culture, they will have a manifestation that may be different, or the expression of a psychological state will differ depending on how much their culture is playing a part in them, right? And how much the family unit or those that are being involved play a major role in their lives. This can all differ very greatly. Again, listen to and use the terms that the families use when during the assessment planning. And again, building trust is incredibly important and is shown to be associated with the increases in what the client is going to share with you, right? Especially in some cultural groups. So we're running out of time, but I'm going to just finish up here. Viewing the treatment through a culturally sensitive, trauma-informed lens, again, connect the families with respective community resources. Be sure that you know what you're connecting them to. I'm adamant about that. You know, early in my career, I would go and talk with or even visit the community resources that I would bring people to. With our organization, we have people that will do that for us, that will make sure that they are reliable resources. So don't just send someone a resource not knowing anything about that resource. Again, we should always, dealing with what we're dealing with, especially now in our country, be very sensitive to the client's fears, especially about their legal status, and understand and let them try to communicate in so many words how it's okay for them to receive treatment and that they will not get in trouble for receiving said treatment, right? Again, we all know that healing comes in many different forms. And so their values, their ideas, although they may differ from their families at times, this is all what, you know, we need to use that, especially, again, we are constantly through the assessment process seeking to understand what is the connection between the client and their family. Is it something where they feel comfortable around their family? Or is it something, you know, where they want the family present? Or is it something where they would really want to keep it private? And that's what brings them comfort, right? And that's what brings them comfort. Again, once they've received a diagnosis or a prognosis, you know, include that in your treatment program, right? How are they doing upon receiving this diagnosis or prognosis? How are they culturally dealing with the diagnosis or prognosis, right? And include that in your treatment plan. So in summary, let's just take a quick look at this quick video. It's got some additional information. Again, remember, this is the 101 on culturally sensitive trauma. So enjoy this video, and then I'm done. If there are any questions, we can take them then.
You know the old saying, don't judge a book by its cover? Well, the same is true when you assess a patient. Hi, I'm Dr. Cruz. Early in my career, I noticed a pattern with some of my patients. They often had multiple health issues, were uneasy during office visits, and frequently visited the emergency department. But worst of all, they never got better despite multiple visits. Then I realized something. From an early age, many of my patients were exposed to trauma and adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. This includes emotional, sexual, or physical abuse, violence, neglect, discrimination, poverty, and other adverse events. ACEs are more common in the US than you'd think. In fact, 60% of US adults have one ACE, 25% have 3 or more ACEs, and 16% have 4 or more. ACEs occur in all socioeconomic groups, but are more common in low-income and minority populations. For young children, repeated exposure to trauma can impact brain development and literally rewire the brain's response to stress. So as they grow up, many struggle with issues related to emotional regulation, like depression, anxiety, or substance use disorders. Trauma survivors are also more often at risk for chronic diseases, behavioral health problems, and even suicide. Knowing all this, I began to rethink my approach to care. Instead of asking patients, what's wrong with you? I ask, what happened to you? Recognizing that life experiences are often a root cause of poor health is integral to improving patient care. Trauma-informed care has helped me take these experiences into account, providing greater insight into my patients' needs and how to address them. Here are 5 key ways that healthcare organizations can gradually integrate trauma-informed care into their practices to help patients and staff. First, build awareness and generate buy-in. Involve both staff and patients in adopting a trauma-informed approach. Second, invest in a trauma-informed workforce. Hire staff that embrace trauma-informed care and provide training not only for clinical staff, but also for non-clinical employees like front desk workers or security guards, who are often the face of your organization. Next, create an environment that is safe and welcoming for patients and staff. Engage patients in meaningful ways. Ask how they feel and listen. You can also build trust by involving them in their own treatment planning. Finally, identify and treat trauma. Consider a screening approach that works for your patients and ensure that treatments and referral sources are available. These changes take time, but each step improves our ability to connect with and care for patients. Today, our patients appreciate the changes we've made. Plus, our staff is more in tune with patients, so work is less stressful and more rewarding. Trauma-informed care. It can truly transform the caregiving experience from being treaters to being healers.
Very
Okay,
good.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the share. That's it for my presentation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Um,
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna ask, does anybody have any questions for Dr. Miranda?
No, no questions for me, but interesting presentation.
So we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. So let's have some takers here.
Hello, everyone. How are you?
Hi.
Dr. Miranda, I have a question.
Hey, Bruce.
When you look and we do referrals onto special providers, how often do you really see people being so sensitive when they're talking to individuals, really tuned in culturally?
Yeah, so again, depending on the institution or the agency that you're working with, you may be limited in regards to referrals. My hope and prayer is that they will give us as spiritual care providers the respect to be able to go outside the agency and the institution to seek referrals and to and resources, because that may be what is necessary. For the client to be able to deal with a resource within their community may be something that is more helpful, something that they may be willing to go somewhere they may be willing to go to, as opposed to us sending them to some other location that they're not familiar with, that is not within their community, or in dealing with other people that may be culturally sensitive. One of the hardest things that I find, Bruce, is that we take all these trainings and then we provide this culturally sensitive, we provide this very culturally sensitive therapy, right, or assessment, and then that's why I say we have to be careful where we make referrals to, because we may be sending them somewhere where they're not very culturally sensitive, and so we're basically back to square one where they shut down.
That has been a frustration, because I have not found people that are that culturally sensitive on the outside as well.
Yeah, no, well, exactly. We're training in this area, but how many people are training in this area? There are people that just enough training to know that, someone is supposed to receive some sort of dietary, change, or perhaps that they should be allowed to worship, for instance. And that's about as far as they go with their cultural sensitivity, but there's so much more to it. Like I said, I've done this training at a workshop level, meaning 8-hour, just the cultural sensitivity, trauma informed care.
Dr. Miranda, there's a question here from Lou T. How does childhood trauma affect those that, I just lost it, affect those that then join the military and then are impacted by PTSD?
Well, I mean, look, PTSD is obviously going to, if it's coming from the original trauma, then obviously it's been working in them for quite some time, right? In dealing with PTSD, or dealing with even trauma that's being exacerbated by daily life and stressors, I find that in dealing with these types of families, one of the things I get, let's say, for instance, it's a husband and wife, and I've had many of them, you'll always hear the terms, he wasn't like that when we met in high school. He wasn't like that when we met in college, right? Why? Because when it comes to childhood trauma, if it's not addressed, it's going to continue to progress. As it progresses, it creates the individual, right? And so if this person is deteriorating already, and then they go into the military, where they're going to be dealing with with a lot of authority, with a lot of stressors, and Lord forbid they find themselves in combat, this can be definitely an area where they're pushed over the edge. And it could definitely exacerbate it greatly. And we've seen that a lot throughout the military. And I think that Dr. Kitchens is going to be addressing some of that in the presentation.
Marcus, there's another question here along the same vein from Jessica. What recommendations or resources would you be able to provide in regards to military cultural sensitivity training? The military within itself is a culture, and when you have a veteran that has been diagnosed with PTSD or MST, sometimes faith-based organizations do not understand.
Yeah, Jessica. Hey, Jessica's doing some wonderful work out there. She's a veteran. She's one of ours. Great to hear from you, Jessica. Yeah, listen, you yourself know that, and you've been working on this, that when it comes to cultural sensitivity, especially within the military, we're not doing well in that area, right? We're not doing well, and I believe that we need to address that. We're dealing with obviously an area where people want to share less about themselves because of the stigma that they may be weak. So a lot of people that have childhood traumas, for instance, they've been living with it forever, or perhaps have been traumatized by something that happened to them prior to going into the military. We've seen, again, not necessarily, I'm not trying to put this on the military, but they themselves are in an environment where they feel that they cannot share, But I also know, speaking to a lot of my colleagues that are in the military chaplains, that there is work being done toward this. Is it as fast as we would like it? Probably not. But my hope and my prayer, and I'm always looking to see how I can help, especially when we're talking about the military, and especially when we're talking about our veterans when they get back.
Another question here from Catherine. How does the age of the patient impact care when focused on culture? For example, young adult versus elder.
Yeah. So I think the more important thing is to understand that when we're dealing with children, we're more than likely going to be dealing with family, right? Whether it's one member of the family or multiple members of the families, or the matriarch and patriarch, depending on their background and their culture. And then when we're dealing with the adult, again, two things. Number one, they may or may not want friends and families involved. So that's something that they have the right to make that decision. And secondly, how far back does the trauma go? So if we're talking about an adult who's 40 years old, 50 years old, whatever the case may be, and they've been dealing with, sexual abuse since they were, 4 years old, and, or dealing with some sort of trauma since back then, I find that these individuals are at an acute stage regarding their PTSD or regarding their trauma.
Marcus, I've got one myself here. I don't expect you to really answer this one. I just want to throw it out there. Dealing with trauma, cultural aspects of trauma with moral injury.
Yeah. I mean, and that my hope and prayer, Chris, is that you can get to this training, and hopefully we can expand on it at some point. But this training is in the hopes that you will be able to get that information from them. So it's not that it's not happening. It's about whether the client, right, or the client's family want to share about this. And I find I've been dealing with a lot of undocumented immigrants who are really, the amount of information that they're going to share is, at the end of the day, not enough for me to make an appropriate assessment to the rest of the team. I do a lot of work for HSI, Homeland Security Investigation, and a lot of the immigrants that we're dealing with, or undocumented immigrants, don't realize that there are components, for instance, in HSI, because all we see in the news is ICE, and breaking down of doors and things like that. We forget this major component of Homeland Security, for instance, within HSI, who I deal with at the New York field office and the New York field office, where they want to help. They want to help these undocumented immigrants. And in many cases, we've gotten them onto that path of getting their immigration status settled here in the US. But a lot of them will not open up, and a lot of them don't believe that what we're saying is true, that Homeland Security is in many cases willing to help.
Somebody else have any other questions out there for Dr.?
I see Peter.
Oh, Peter, you got one there?
Peter Grinion?
Yeah, unmute yourself, Peter.
Peter. He is muted.
Right. Great presentation, my brother.
Peter, good to see you always.
Yeah, always. No, you may have addressed this, but I just want you to speak to it, because there are different cultures represented right here. Could you speak a little more about one's cultural competence? Because sometimes one may think that he or she is culturally competent when that's not the case.
Right. Well, there's two sides to that, right? Let's talk about ourselves as individuals. Are we still connected to our cultures? I know my nieces and nephews aren't. I'm from Puerto Rican and Dominican descent, and they have nothing to do with it. They were born here, and they want nothing to do with it. So they're going to grow up to deal with their own traumas here in the United States, but there will be no effect on them regarding, culture. Whereas with others who are still very connected to their cultures, probably even very connected to their country of origin, and visit there very often, this may have a greater impact on how they deal with trauma, right? How did they deal with it back in your country? How did they deal with it back in, how did your parents deal with it? How did grandparents deal with it? That's usually, if you're very, very culturally sensitive and you're very attached to your culture, that's probably how you're going to deal with it. And I think that that's important. The other side of that is the education, right? And the trainings that people like you and me are getting, right? We need to receive more of this training to be able to properly deal with people who are dealing with culturally sensitive trauma, where their culture plays a major role in how they perceive trauma. We need to become familiar with that in order to help them. If we simply think that culture means, the color of your skin or where you came from or what is your religious, affiliation. And so for some people, that's all that it is, cultural sensitivity training. Well, I have news for you. There's a lot more you need to learn.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay, we've got another one here. This is kind of a detailed one. Are there blocking differences, in quotes, that are culturally derived? The thin blue line with LEOs, First Nation communities, religious lines that are more evident in the community than in docs. Where are the keys to unlock these very real and visible differences?
Mhm. Wow, that's a very detailed question. The first thing I would say is that what we do with our chaplains is that if they are interested in helping this situation with the thin blue line or dealing with law enforcement, then they should receive additional training. We constantly are sending our chaplains, those that want to deal with law enforcement, to receive additional trainings through various law enforcement citizens academies, so they can have some familiarity. It's incredible the amount of people that want to deal with law enforcement or try to be some sort of an answer to their many complications and many complexities, and yet know nothing about their culture. So culture can not only be somewhere we come from and who we are, right? And in terms of our ethnicities, our nationalities, whatever the case may be, or how much we've kept in touch with our culture. But cultures can also be within the workplace. So we know that correctional officers have their own culture, right? That NYPD and Suffolk County and Sheriff's Department, these law enforcement has its own culture. I was working with a couple of police officers that were sent to me because they got into some trouble, nothing major, but they thought that they should, part of their getting back to work is that they had to do about, seeing me once a week for 10 weeks. And one of the things that I've tried to do is to try to change the whole aspect of the thin blue line, right? That the thin blue line is not there to have you all protect each other, even if you're doing corrupt things, right? So there's a conception that the thin blue line is there to protect one another, have each other's backs, even if the other officer is doing something corrupt. And that's not the case. We can look at the thin blue line through a different lens. So we're seeing it as, yes, protecting each other, having each other's backs, but also being that person who can say, you need to stop doing this because it's not the right thing to do and we're going to get in trouble. So that's another aspect of how we're dealing with these barriers as well. But that's an amazing question. I'd love to discuss that more. Who was it that said it? Was it Reggie?
It was what was it? Carl.
Yeah, Carl, definitely. There's a lot going on in that area.
There's another one here. This is interesting. How do you deal? This is from Pedro. How do we deal with religious trauma within the cultural context?
Well, religion is a major part of culture, right? I know it is for me and probably for many of you. I was basically, in many cases, I didn't have a decision, right? I didn't make a decision for the faith group that I'm a part of. I was born into it, right? Later on in life, yeah, I was able to decide whether I wanted to stay or whether I wanted to move into another, faith affiliation. However, yes, there is a lot of trauma, and I myself suffered a lot of trauma at the hands of uneducated, incompetent Pentecostal pastors in the Hispanic community when I was growing up. When it came to them, everything I did sent me to hell, right? So as a child, I spent more time in hell than I did on earth. And that had a traumatic effect on me that I had to work on. And so this has happened greatly. Religion plays a major role in helping, healing, or even traumatizing individuals.
Here's a good question from our own Peter Cook. So many of us represent institutions which are not generally regarded as culturally sensitive places. Docks, sheriff's department, police departments, military, for example. How do work in a culturally sensitive way when the mere mention of the institution you represent can generate trauma for the person you are caring for?
Talk to me, Peter.
The
People-
Black Lives Matter comes right in here in my, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And the fact that, I mean, how many threats did I get? And how many people said those horrible things about me simply because our organization obviously helps all people and all institutions, but a lot of law enforcement, right? We provide services. And somehow the people think that because I am a chaplain within, for instance, the New York State Fraternal Order of Police or Homeland Security investigations, that somehow I'm gonna go ahead and be okay with their crap or with their crap. And no, I constantly tell them I'm there to provide a service, but I stand on the side of righteousness. And I think that
Absolutely.
has to get across that, you know, when you're talking about, for instance, the NYPD, and we're looking at 40,000 members, we're looking at an army that is the size of some third world countries' armies, right? That when we find people that are doing things that they shouldn't be doing or that are horrible, that we, the chaplains, are going to stand on the right side of righteousness, that we're going to go ahead and point it out. And also a reminder that when we talk about law enforcement, for instance, the majority of these people are going out, right? Family members, they are going out to do the right thing. Yes, when you have this one rotten apple that does something horrible, we should bring attention to it. We should go ahead and filter it out and get it out of the way. But there's one thing I have learned throughout my years dealing with law enforcement agencies, and is that good cops do not like bad cops. And so we need to, and that's what I'm trying to do, and that's what many of us should do, is that we should try to create that platform where the good cops are not going to be punished by coming out or being whistleblowers. And I think we need more of that. And we're seeing it actually here in New York. We're seeing it at Nassau County, I know, in Long Island, and Suffolk County, where I'm working as well. So we do need to put in some work as well. We can't just expect for it to happen by itself.
Carl suggests here that, oh, I'm sorry.
It's Evelyn.
Oh, Evelyn, yes.
Yes, I just have a question. Working in Department of Corrections, when an incarcerated individual or inmate, when they come into the facility, first of all, most of them have been traumatized pretty much most of their lives from childhood. Okay, and then they come into a facility and then they're traumatized again. And now it's time for them to be released. And then when they're released, they're traumatized again. So is there anything that you can recommend that we can look into upon their release so that they can get help for the trauma? We as chaplains, we help them as much as we can while they're in the facility. However, when they leave the facility, it's going to happen again in some form or fashion. So is there anything you would recommend when they are released, or agencies that are out there? Or I know there's therapy and counseling, but is there anything that you would highly recommend for someone, for incarcerated individuals?
Yeah, look, I recommend that the work that you were, well, first of all, let me start from the beginning. In many cases, we're dealing with systems, and we have to decide how much of it we want to give our lives to as chaplains, right? A lot of times we don't want to ruffle feathers because a lot of people want to keep their jobs, right? They're afraid of losing their jobs. And so I've witnessed that. And obviously I've counseled quite a number of chaplains in this area. And I totally understand when you have a family and this is your income, you're going to do the best work that you can, but you also don't want to get to the point where you're ruffling feathers. That said, we need to get to a place, and it may not be you, but it may be somebody from the outside like myself. I ruffle feathers all the time. And my people, Reverend Kim Osorio is on here. She's our VP of operations. I ruffle feathers all the time, but I can afford to do that. You know, I can afford to ruffle feathers, because sometimes we deal in a correctional system that is not correcting anything, right?
Yeah.
So I know that in New York City, we have a really broken system when it comes to Rikers Island right now.
Yeah.
And sometimes when you try to figure out how you can help, I mean, there's no answer, right? Like everybody keeps passing you on to the next person. So my hope is that we're going to be able to work with this next mayor, Eric Adams, that's coming in. But that being said, whatever work you've started, it's important that we as chaplains, that we make friends, that we make contacts with outside community organizations that we can sit with, that are people that can continue the work that we started inside the walls, so that they can continue that work outside the walls. The problem is that you started a particular program inside the walls, and when you go ahead and send them to a resource that you're not familiar with outside the walls, it's not the same thing that you were doing. So what I've done for myself is to get acquainted and become really friendly, but also become an active participant within community-based organizations that are dealing with reentry, who are trying to reduce recidivism, and that are kind of implementing, and I've given them ideas of programs that I use, right, that they can implement on the outside, so that when that individual is going from what you were, pouring into their lives on the behind the walls, when they get to that community-based organization outside the walls, that they are receiving similar and continuous therapy or training in that area. And I think that that's a major problem. They come out from something that you had established, Evelyn, with them, a wonderful rapport, a wonderful program with them. And then when they come out, they no longer have that. And so they don't stay within that community-based organization. They just say, this is not the same, and I'm out. And I think if we can get something where we can literally get follow-up therapy, or follow-up assessment, or follow-up visits, similar to what we're doing on the behind the walls, then that would probably have a better success rate.
And you're in the New York City area, right?
That's right. Yeah, we are in the New York City area, and our chaplains are providing services all the way from Canada and Buffalo, New York, all the way through the boroughs, and then now we're in 19 states.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn.
Okay, we need to end here. Interesting. Carl made a suggestion here that the chaplains are supposed to serve uniformed staff too, and that maybe some chaplains wouldn't be bad for them to receive a little CO training. Might not be a bad idea. And but at this point, I think maybe we could just do this one real quick, and then we'll take this as our last. From Kathleen. How often do you see that it is class or SES rather than culture?
I'm sorry, say it again.
I'm not sure what that means. How often do you see that it is class or SES rather than culture?
Not sure what that means.
I'm not sure either.
Can they?
Yeah. Well, I think we need to end right now. We're going to start back up at 10:45.
I think Pedro, I believe, I can't see it too well because it went up. Yeah, definitely. Peter or Chris or Bruce, if you can give Pedro my number, we can definitely further discuss, because he doesn't feel that I answered the question
Okay.
entirely. So I'd love to do that.